Hey everyone, welcome back to the hardware news recap for the week. In this one, we're talking about the official RTX 3070 delay. That is not a rumor. The Zen 3 rumors about Ryzen 5000 series, but we're not going to cover all of them because there's questionable legitimacy to some of those. And we'll be talking about the BIOS rollout for existing Ryzen motherboards, what some of the motherboard vendors have been putting in their BIOS code that's been tricking people, like X590 references. We'll be talking about some high-end computing, HPE, Microsoft, and storage feature testing and EK vertical GPU mounts for water-cooled and air-cooled GPUs. Before that, this video is brought to you by Arctic Cooling and its Liquid Freezer 2 line. Arctic is actively restocking its Liquid Freezer 2 coolers that rank among the top performers for CPU coolers right now, including on Ryzen CPUs. The Liquid Freezer 2 series is focused on high thermal performance and value, featuring a blackout design and including a VRM fan mounted on top of the pump block to help provide airflow over neighboring VRM heatsinks. Arctic has also started selling its P12 120 case fans. Learn more at the links in the description below. First up is the RTX 3070 delay. You may have heard of this one at this point because it's been pretty big news in the last 24 hours or so since filming anyway. And this appears to be maybe an effort to mitigate the possibility of another, we'll go with disastrous or subpar, if we're being a little bit less dramatic, GPU launch. So NVIDIA has rolled back the availability date of its 3070. Originally, we were hearing that it was supposed to be around October 15th for release, and reviews we'd probably be working on one right now. But instead, it looks like it's going back to October 29th, and that'll mark about a 2-week delay from previously, and it puts it right next to AMD's RX 6000 event. So from NVIDIA's perspective, this is good and bad. It's bad because they can't preempt the event and try to make some initial sales before AMD's cards become available, or announced actually. They might not be available right away. It's good because from NVIDIA's perspective strictly, it might be able to try and drown out some of the noise around AMD's event. We'll see how it plays out though. Ultimately, this is probably a move to try and get at least a little bit more inventory in hand before the launch, but an extra 2 weeks doesn't really move the needle that much when you're talking global logistics. In its statement on upcoming availability, NVIDIA expressly states the desire to get more cards out on launch day, as well as to global board partners. And it also noted that the previous 3080 and 3090 launches were known to be less supply than NVIDIA had desired to have available to meet demand. This was stated originally when it launched the cards and faced immediate backlash about availability of the products. Now, as we've covered in the past couple weeks now, just inventory alone isn't the end of the world, but inventory alone combined with accidental leaking of personal information through its website, crashing issues that were mostly resolved with drivers, but nonetheless issues that existed, bot issues, and everything else the 3000 series has run into, NVIDIA's had a lot to contend with, and this is probably a means to try and resolve that. Finally, on this topic, there's been some updates to the capacitor story as well, where, as you may know, our 3080 FTW3 was a world record card. Even without liquid nitrogen, it did very well just on air, and then with liquid nitrogen, it was briefly a world record card. So that card had the quote-unquote like bad capacitor arrangement, and there's a few sides to this story to cover. So we didn't dive too deep into this one other than covering some of the basics and the business politics behind it, why things really happened the way they did behind the scenes. But in terms of testing, it lined up right when we sort of walked away from the studio for a little bit to get a break. So to recap everyone on what's happened in the interim, Der Bauer had a really good video that we'd encourage you to check out, Der Bauer on YouTube, where he changed the capacitor array on the back of one of his RTX 30 series cards. And in doing so, he established that with the different capacitor solution using like the higher end MLCC layout that he had soldered on there by hand, he was able to increase the clock speeds by maybe 30 megahertz or so. So there is a benefit to having a better capacitor solution. We spoke with EVGA about this. They were aware of Roman's video, actually alerted us to it originally, and they saw similar things in their own testing. But this is a matter of you can improve the parts and get a little bit better performance. It was not, however, necessarily a direct link to the crashing issue, although it's sort of a workaround where you could fix the crashing issue. The real problem was, as we stated about a week ago in our live stream, the real issue was the frequency being too high, and vBIOS can resolve this issue. So some of the board partners behind the scenes prior to reviews going up were talking with us saying, you might want to wait on doing the testing because we may release a different vBIOS to improve stability. And later that story is what developed into, the capacitors are all bad. So it's sort of true for both, but the real issue was the frequency being too high. So Der Bauer has a great video talking about the capacitor side of things and where there actually is a meaningful difference, sort of. And then Hardware Unboxed did a video talking about the frequency side of things. And so we'll point you to both of those coverage pieces to get the final story on all of that. That way we can just move on here because we've got so many other things we need to do. We're doing 2 videos a day and live streams, 20 hours of live streams over about a 10-day period. So we'll leave that one to those two for the coverage if you want to learn more about it. Moving on, rumors. So Zen 3 allegedly arriving as Ryzen 5000. We want to start off here with the X590 notes. A few people have seen that Gigabyte's BIOS update, as motherboard vendors have rolled out BIOS updates for Zen 3 support, had an X590 reference in it. This led the internet to scramble and say that there's going to be a new X590 chipset. To our knowledge, this was once true, and we've talked about this before actually. About a year ago or just over, AMD was originally planning to do an X590 and an X570 set of chipsets, and they were planning to segment the PCIe support between the two of them, so you'd have a higher end one for maybe like a 3950X, and then one for everything else. That didn't come to fruition. AMD ended up axing it and instead going for just a single X570 chipset solution, as you all saw, and so nothing ever became of X590. The fact that it has reemerged in the BIOS code for Gigabyte's BIOS, as we understand it from asking around, is actually just an artifact of that original plan, where actually in BIOSes from the initial launch of X570, you also saw X590 references, and people then thought that was going to be a board coming out shortly, and obviously it wasn't. It never came out. So our understanding is this is old strings of text in BIOS that managed to creep their way back in over time with the BIOS updates. So from what we understand today, X590 and its presence in the BIOS updates you've seen, it's not preparing for some new X590 board. It's just an artifact of an old product that was killed and never came out. So getting that one out of the way first, because there were a lot of rumors about X590 potentially being a new motherboard, but it's, to our understanding, it is not going to be the case. All right. Additionally, so we should know more about AMD's Zen 3 architecture later this month. Actually, next week, we should be getting an official news event from AMD that we'll be covering certainly on the day it goes up. And Zen 3 CPUs are supposedly skipping the 4000 series naming entirely, which is, we think, good if it's true, and launching instead as Ryzen 5000. The reason this would be good is just because AMD's naming is kind of a mess right now, and it's already got 4000 series named CPUs out there that are completely different architecture, so it might be the right move to just completely move on to another naming scheme. So, hardware leaker TUM_APISAK spotted new listings in the Ashes of the Singularity benchmarks that showed an alleged AMD Ryzen 7 5800X entry, and the chip is listed as an 8-core 16-thread processor. This should be a Zen 3 successor to the 3800X. Now, a couple things about this. First of all, some of the rumors that are out there right now are pointing towards weird core configurations that, if you look at AMD's architecture and its chiplet design, makes zero sense. Like, for example, 10-core CPUs. It doesn't really make sense with the way the CCXs are laid out. So that, combined with the X590 alarms that were raised about a chipset and a motherboard that don't exist, and combined with the numbers we're seeing, lead us to sort of go down the path of be careful of what you're reading into with rumors right now of Ryzen, because a lot of them, as we've seen, don't really make a lot of sense. It's artifacts of old launches, it's incorrect, whatever. So we'll cover this stuff and the performance as we actually get the products in hand, is what we're getting at here. But in the spirit of covering some of this, AMD already has its line of Ryzen 4000 G series devices for mobile components. Those are APUs. They bear the 4000 branding. And two, from what we know of Zen 3 so far, it's likely enough of an overhaul under the hood at least to warrant a shift in the naming. A leaked processor programming reference, or PPR, outlined a few key details about Zen 3, such as the changes to the CCD and CCX structure, an allegedly unified 32 megabytes of L3 cache per CCX, a scalable data fabric or SDF being built up to support 512 gigabytes per DRAM channel. And this obviously doesn't mean it's going to be on desktop necessarily, but could scale to their other devices as well. And some other changes were rumored to be improved latency and coherency and further refinement of AMD's MCM approach. So what we'd really like to see with Zen 3 or future AMD Ryzen iterations would be improvements in Infinity Fabric, where there's the most limitations for the CPUs currently. Anyway, we're going to leave the numbers out of it in terms of the performance claims, just because there's been a lot of bad information out there lately about AMD's Ryzen stuff, and we don't want to be part of it. Next one, Zen 3 motherboard support beginning to roll out. So this is all official. This is not rumors. In Zen 3 land this week, it seems like motherboard makers are starting to pop up support. So first among the board makers to transition to Zen 3 support was MSI, who rolled out a new firmware update for some of the existing motherboards that it has in the 500 series AM4 lineup. Gigabyte was included as well, again with the X590 reference, which, to be very clear here, was not going to be a thing. MSI revealed that it's pushing out a combo PI BIOS v2 1.1.0.0 if you're curious about the Agisa version. And that's an update to 570 and B550 chipset-based motherboards. It also noted that the update should roll out to A520-based motherboards. Those are the new low-end chipsets we covered recently towards the end of October for those updates. And in addition to optimizations for current Ryzen processors, the usual stability improvements that you see in BIOS, stuff like that, there's also an updated SMU and some DDR4 overclocking fixes that will benefit you, in theory, if you're on a current CPU, not just the new ones. MSI also noted support for, quote, future AM4 socket processors. Not a surprise what those are. That's going to be Zen 3 stuff. And then those future socket AM4 processors will be compatible with these X570 boards. So that much we know right now. As for whether there are new motherboards or not, we don't know yet. But the X570, B550 stuff, based on these compatibility updates that are being put out by the motherboard makers, should be compatible, should remain compatible. Cornelis Networks breathing new life into Intel's Omni-Path for the next story. So Intel's first generation Omni-Path interconnects, or OPA 100 series, were meant to be Intel's answer to Mellanox's InfiniBand product line, which are switches and whose parent company was acquired by NVIDIA recently. So Mellanox is now owned by NVIDIA. This has been pushing Intel into higher speed networking and interconnect solutions. However, after only one generation, Intel seemingly abandoned the Omni-Path architecture and halted development on the OPA 200 series. However, Intel is now spinning out its Omni-Path business into an entirely separate company. Cornelis Networks, according to CRN, is made up of former Intel employees who worked on Intel's Omni-Path under Intel previously. Cornelis Networks announced its Series A funding that brought in $20 million from the likes of Downing Ventures and Intel Capital, which is Intel's venture capital and investment division. And Philip A. Murphy Jr., CEO of Cornelis Networks and formerly of Intel, stated that he and his colleagues approached Intel about spinning out Omni-Path when it became apparent that the technology no longer aligned with Intel's strategy. Intel apparently agreed, and Cornelis Networks received Intel's Omni-Path IP, existing inventory, and additional assets in exchange for Intel Capital receiving a stake in Cornelis Networks. Murphy also stated that under Cornelis Networks, Omni-Path will see next-generation products, possibly under a new brand, and Cornelis Networks is planning on working to support existing Omni-Path customers and to continue selling first-gen Omni-Path products. Up next, leaked Windows XP source code that we talked about a week or two ago in Hardware News appears to be actually legitimate. At the time we first talked about it, was not clear yet if the Windows XP source code leaks were real, and now it looks like that is true. So while Microsoft wouldn't, and as of this writing still hasn't officially confirmed or denied the leak, security researchers immediately began poring over the code as expected and suggested that it was legitimate, albeit incomplete. If you fast forward a week or so, we now know that the source code is that of Windows XP and Windows Server 2003. According to ZDNet, who spoke with Microsoft engineers of both past and present, the code does appear to be authentic, but again is lacking in its completion. Furthermore, at least one astute user has compiled the code into a working version of the now ancient operating systems. The NT-Dev YouTube channel, which focuses on Windows and software, successfully compiled the code, both confirming its legitimacy and the fact that some components are missing. Quote, "Well, the reports were indeed true. It seems that there are some components missing, such as winlogon.exe and lots of drivers," NT-Dev told ZDNet. However, while the videos were briefly available to view and may have been pulled down somewhere, they've since been taken down following a copyright claim from Microsoft. So, in lieu of an official statement, it seems that this basically will serve as one. I think we can all take away what we need to take away from that action. So it looks like the leak was legitimate at this point. And what that means, well, we'll see. Potentially get interesting spin-offs of open source operating systems that shouldn't exist, at least by Microsoft's considerations, or in the worst case, more security vulnerabilities for no longer supported operating systems. It may be encouragement to move on from them for the companies that haven't yet, although certainly plenty of factories are still running XP and 3.1 even, and those machines aren't connected to anything except for whatever factory machine they're controlling, so those wouldn't really matter that much. HPE announced that it will build and deliver a new supercomputer to the National Nuclear Security Administration, or NNSA, for the purpose of modeling the behavior of nuclear weapons. The system, known as Crossroads, will be based on the new HPE Cray-X supercomputer. And the Cray-X, fair warning, Googling this returns results that are not particularly helpful nor related to Cray or its X supercomputer model. The Cray-X is a blade-based cluster built inside of a sealed liquid-cooled cabinet. Cray is no foreigner to liquid cooling. In fact, some of its earliest supercomputers were liquid-cooled and even had sort of a waterfall feature installed to them. It's something that we saw at the Mountain View Computer History Museum if you're ever in that area and you want to check it out. So while we don't have the exact specs on Crossroads, it's said to offer quadruple the performance of the system it's intended to replace, which is called Trinity. And the Trinity supercomputer is currently ranked at number 11 on the top 500 list of supercomputers in the world, and it was rolled out in 2 stages and partitions. There's the first partition that uses Haswell Xeons, and then the second partition, if we can call it that anyway, that uses the Finite's Landing Xeons. So Trinity offers a peak performance of 41.4 petaflops. For perspective, HPE's Cray-X solution is largely based on Cray's Shasta architecture, which was actually Cray's first supercomputer platform aimed at exascale computing, hence the X part of the name too. So the Shasta architecture is set to power upcoming exascale computers such as Aurora, which we've spoken about recently. It will also power El Capitan and Frontier, both of which we've spoken about in news videos as well, and one of which includes some AMD parts, at least one of which. Also, an HPE Cray-X 3000 cabinet is said to accommodate up to 64 blades. It is supposed to use 8 compute chassis for that support, and each compute chassis can power up to those 8 blades. The HPE Cray-X 3000 supports HPE Cray-X 425 blades, which come equipped with 2 boards per blade, and each board offers 2 sockets for a total of 4 sockets per blade. The HPE Cray-X 425 blade and their boards support AMD's EPYC 7002 series CPUs and 8 DIMMs per socket with up to 64 gigabyte DIMMs at 3200. So while the Cray-X platform is built for AMD's EPYC line, Crossroads will actually use Intel's 10 nanometer Sapphire Rapids Xeon CPUs. It's also important to remember here that the HPE Cray-X supercomputer is purely x86 based. There's no heterogeneous CPU, GPU computing design integrated that's worth speaking of. So no new information yet on how many cabinets Crossroads will use or any suggested performance metrics. Crossroads is also scheduled to be deployed in spring of 2022, so it's a while out and will remain in service through at least 2026. Crossroads also marks another notable supercomputer win for Intel behind the Intel-based Aurora supercomputer. Up next is some Microsoft Windows news. So Microsoft is testing some new storage and monitoring features right now. Alongside the Windows 10 Insider Preview Build 20226 announcement that was posted recently, Microsoft also announced that it would be testing new storage monitoring features related to SSD health. Some of this will probably be integrated smart stat attributes, for example. So This should at least alert users about SSDs becoming unhealthy, which again, you can derive from smart software that's out there now. But many SSDs ship with their own software, like Samsung's SSD Magician as a popular example. And this type of software allows users to monitor the drive for potential failures and reports on various diagnostics. However, not all SSDs ship with such software, and Windows doesn't currently offer any included features for SSD health. Quote, the feature is designed to detect hardware abnormalities for NVMe SSDs and notify users with enough time to act. It's strongly recommended that users immediately back up their data after receiving a notification, and that's from Microsoft. Most modern hard drives and SSDs will support smart systems, and it may be that Microsoft is testing a Win 10 feature that will report that to the user. This has also been seen where Microsoft has rolled out other popular monitoring features. Now there's actually even a GPU temperature readout in Task Manager, and there are already the GPU getting included in Task Manager in greater detail is also somewhat new. It wasn't really, you didn't really get much before. So now you can break it down into, say, CUDA, into 3D, into copy, all those within Task Manager. So Windows is improving its monitoring feature set, which is a good thing. If you want all of that stuff, obviously there is third-party software that will do it. Hardware Info 64 is a great one that we can highly recommend. And then there's plenty of drive-related smart readers out there too. Up next, Corsair is testing the ceiling with its K100 RGB keyboard, specifically the ceiling for price of a keyboard built by a large non-keyboard specific company. So this is a new top-end keyboard at $230. Corsair is, again, certainly testing the price consumers are willing to pay out of box for it. The K100 RGB looks set to slot in directly above Corsair's K95 RGB Platinum, itself a $200 keyboard that at the time was also expensive. Corsair's K100 RGB does offer a couple of notable evolutions over the K95 Platinum, but whether or not they justify an additional $30 isn't really for us to say. We don't do much for keyboard reviews. First, Corsair has continued its iCUE evolution with the manifestation of a full-blown iCUE wheel adorned at the top left corner of the board. Aside from the name, it seems the scroll wheel could also have some convenient uses under certain circumstances, perhaps, for example, in Adobe Premiere or Photoshop, or adjusting volume, zooming in and out, scrolling left and right, things like that, or assigning keyboard shortcuts separately. Second, Corsair is also unveiling its first switch design, the Corsair OPX optical switches. These switches seem similar to Razer's optical switches and are rated for 150 million clicks lifecycle. These switches offer a 1mm actuation point and linear travel. Corsair is also touting its Axon technology, which is responsible for the 4,000 Hz polling and key scanning rate of the K100 RGB keyboard. As mentioned previously, the K100 RGB will cost $230. It's out now. We're not really planning to review it. We might test some of the claims on the frequency, though, if we find the time. The keyboard will also come with an option for Cherry MX Red switches, should the optical switches not be of interest for the audience. Finally, also in actual news, it's nice to have a lot of real news coming out and not just rumors. Normally when there's major GPU launches, there's a lot of rumors because companies don't want to announce things and get buried by GPUs. So actual news, EK's vertical GPU bracket for open loops and for air cooling to an extent announced recently. So this is following in the steps of companies like CableMod and its own successful vertical GPU bracket. The biggest differentiation between good and bad vertical GPU mounts is normally the spacing between the glass and the mount. So a lot of people like to take numbers from our testing and other testing that show the poor performance of vertically mounted GPUs in some cases, and then extrapolate it to just mean vertical mount bad. But it's not that simple. In fact, some of the cases we've tested, and actually some of the mounts we've tested, like CableMods in the past, will provide often better performance as long as there's sufficient distance from the glass, because you're getting it away from the motherboard too, and that's a positive thing, but it's when it's right against the glass that you have an issue. So as for this one, this is supposed to be positioned further from the glass from what we can see so far. It will be contingent upon the case as well, of course. And the solution is aimed at both air and water, but is pictured mostly with water. EK is a water cooling company after all. It's supposed to be called the EK Loop Vertical GPU Holder, and EK says it'll work in, quote, any ATX PC case that has an open-style rear PCIe I/O layout. The structure's materials just steel. It's 1.5 millimeters thick, and it uses 2 motherboard standoff screws for extra stability. EK kind of overplays its hand on claiming the dangers of vertical mounts. It's not like people really move their computers around that much. Certainly not really going to LAN parties that often anymore, especially right now. But the solution does appear to be of higher structural stability and quality. It's just that the language used by EK emphasizing the dangers of such a mount does seem like it's just a little bit on the overdramatic side. But anyway, EK says 1 to 2 slot designs will fit from the IO shield perspective. It says that height doesn't matter. Keep in mind that it will if you have an air cooler in there. The tower may end up limiting the height of the GPU, so make sure you map that out. And overall, vertical mounts, just as a reminder again, are not universally bad. It does depend on how they are implemented. And also, cases like the SL600M, you'll see better performance with a vertically mounted GPU because the fans are at the bottom and it's pushing air straight into the fins in most cases. So that's it for this one. Thanks for watching. Subscribe for more as always. You can go to store.gamersnexus.net or patreon.com/gamersnexus to help us out directly, and we'll see you all next time.